Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby, which that's a lot of sounds all in a row for this Starfleet Academy member. And if you thought the first like 3 quarters of that intro was good and the last quarter kind of fell apart, you are ready for today's episode. I won't even tease the name. I'm going to turn this right over to Fert Derby for some background.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther, and thanks, Trekkies, for sticking with us. We are in episode 62 of the Warp Core podcast. We are fast approaching the end of season 2 of the original series, and within just a few short episodes, we will not only be talking about the end of this season, we'll also be talking about our favorite highlights and lowlights from a roller coaster ride that NBC gave us in the middle slice of this sandwich. We had seasons 1 and 3 bracketing season 2, and the best you can say is doesn't look like they left anything on the table, but maybe some of it should have been left in a drawer. And that may very well be where we're leaning on this episode of Star Trek. This is the Omega Glory. First aired on March 1st, 1968. So officially it could fall under the umbrella of March Madness. The director was Vincent McEvedy, who most recently just did Patterns of Force, Star Trek Meets the Nazi Regime. And we covered that in Warp Core 60, just a couple of short episodes ago. Make sure you go back and check out what we thought of Mr. McEvedy's proclivities. But he is a Star Trek vet. He doesn't have quite the number of credits under his belt as some of our returning champions, but he's been around the block, so he kind of knows the score. The writer was showrunner, series creator, head guru, great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry. And as it turns out, this episode, or at least an early version of this episode, was one of the 3 outlines that was submitted to NBC to create the second Star Trek pilot. You'll recall that The Cage, which we talked all the way back in like the early 20s, 30s of our Warp Core broadcast, The Cage was shot and then never made it to air because the executive said, what the hell is this? And so they gave him a second bite at the apple. And so there were 3 proposals, outlines, scripts submitted like for a do-over. And this Omega Glory was one of them. The others were Mudd's Women, which we ended up talking about in Warp Core 32. And Where No Man Has Gone Before, which eventually is the one that was chosen, selected, and aired. And we talked about that in Warp Core 30. So you can go back and see what Starfleet, this distinguished band of brothers, had to say on all of that. But this episode did not get selected as the second pilot, but it did end up in the production stream in the second season here. And when you see a Gene Roddenberry or a show's creator, in the writing credits, there's an extra little bit of expectation, right? Because, they're the ones who have championed this and sat through the meetings and pounded out the scripts and hired the actors and do all of that. So there's a certain feeling that, I should pay attention because Gene Roddenberry himself is taking center stage here. And this was, probably unquestionably his vision. It's not as if 10 people rewrote him. So the buck stops with Gene. And so what does he have to tell us? And why was this episode, amongst the myriad of Star Trek episodes, why did this one, curry his favor, capture his attention, and so forth? And again, as teased by UrzaMaster, it starts off very promisingly. We have, again, this idea of a mysterious disease may have worked its way through a sister starship, one that looks at least in the revised visual effects, almost exactly like NCC 1701. So the idea of seeing like split screen two Enterprise type Starfleet ships orbiting a planet, I mean, that's great. And then they beam on, and there's a bunch of empty Starfleet uniforms, and everybody's been turned into rock salt. And I mean I know we recently covered where the Enterprise crewmen were turned into geometric cubes, and some of them were crushed into rock salt. So we have this sort of reoccurring motif now where everybody's into crystals. But that's exciting. And then we beam down to a planet, and we've got a situation where it appears that as they refer to them, the Asiatic people have won a planet-wide civil war and have basically turned the Caucasian white inhabitants, almost regress them back to Planet of the Apes, where they are barely capable of speech, and they're living in rags and so forth. There's also some allusions to Native American and indigenous populations. Anyways, there's a lot going on, and you're kind of like, okay, we have all these story threads. Sulu's back. They must have finished the reshoots on Green Berets. You have the USS Exeter. You have this genuinely sort of creepy opening, and you've set up this sort of mad captain who believes that the planet has a fountain of youth that can extend lives for hundreds of years. And actually, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking back to the big screen Next Generation 1998 Star Trek Insurrection, which, again, whether they overtly or covertly had lifted any elements or were reminded, as they were going through the show, hey, that's not a bad idea. There are some similarities, and they're not exactly buried in the substrata. I mean, you can see them almost, some of them on the surface if you choose to look. But again, sort of an exciting premise, right? What the Prime Directive may have been interfered with here. Again, what would Starfleet do if they had the keys to the Fountain of Youth? There's all sorts of places this could go. And I'm really interested in where my fellow warp cores kind of came down, because from where this viewer was, I thought that the first two, maybe 2.5 acts of our standard 60-minute episode were, again, moving along, well-paced, real sense of jeopardy, all sorts of ways you could go. And I don't think that Gene stuck the landing, because sort of by the last act for sure, suddenly it almost feels like we're watching a completely different episode, or all the paths that could have been open to them, they chose one that was kind of the most puzzling. So I'm interested in sort of the raw feedback from my wingmen here, and that's kind of where I want to open up the discussion. So, gentlemen, like, how was it when suddenly we went from a disease and the Fountain of Youth and possibly another Vietnam Native American like allegory into a weird defense of the U.S. Constitution?
I mean, okay. I had some problems with the final act of this episode. I'm not gonna lie. May Gene Roddenberry rest in peace, but this was not his finest hour. I think what we have here is 2/3 of a great episode, very similar to Star Trek Insurrection, which I think is an underrated Star Trek film, and we talked about that here on the Warp Core already. That it's like one big long episode of the show, which stands to reason. A lot of these original series episodes got essentially redone on Next Gen or on later, issues in the franchise. This one, I think, absolutely deserved a reimagining. And Insurrection, I think, does it justice. I think that's how this episode should have somehow played out, or similar to it in some degree. I think it was great because nothing was convenient. Again, there was like a constant struggle throughout the episode to get the crew in a place where they're going to succeed. Like you really didn't know that this was going to play out in their favor at any point. I mean, obviously, we know from watching the movies and the series, like they're going to get out of this. But at the time, you have to think like this was high stakes. You really didn't know, is Kirk going to be able to overcome this fellow captain? Are they going to be stuck here? Like, it's pretty good. And then all of a sudden, it shifts to this like you know hill people who somehow have a castle and they have an American flag on a completely foreign planet. They really don't explain too much how there's like an exact allegory, or excuse me, an exact copy of the United States, like just out there. And I think that's where this really fell flat. Is like they never gave any exposition around that. Like, was this a former Earth colony that before the Prime Directive they tried to make this happen, and it was too warring, like a Khan storyline. They had an Asiatic person and a white person, and those two ended up becoming in conflict somehow. And this is what happened: is one founded the United States and another founded the Mongol Empire or something. It was far fetched, but it could have been something. It just didn't. Like there's 2/3 of this episode is like, well, this is really decent. Like this, it's not amazing, but it's okay. Like it was really arming up. Like if this has a good payoff, this could be a strong episode. And then I don't know. I mean, I really just it absolutely baffled me why they ended it the way they did.
Right, and it's a shame because Morgan Woodward, who plays Captain Tracy, I mean, we've now come through 40, 50 plus episodes of the original series. He is as formidable, a villain. I mean, maybe we don't put him on the level of Khan and Ricardo Montalban just because, that's always in our hearts. But like at every point, he is like there to jam up Kirk's plans or to fight him and like physically get the best of him. By the way, a lot of judo chops in this one, and I know that Lord Uther loves the judo chops. But he was actually, again, until the climax, he was actually one of the better original series villains. Like he came across with genuine menace. Like this was a guy, he wasn't hamming it up, he wasn't over the top. He was sinister, and he was calculating, and he always seemed to be a half a step ahead of our heroes. And I mean, again, it's like, you just feel like the air slowly slipping out of the balloon, like, oh. And then
you really do. You feel cheated.
Right. And then it's a shame. I mean, we certainly get a lot of fights between him and Kirk, but that pretty much, it reduces what could have been a great battle of wills to 4 or 5 physical confrontations. And after about the second or third of them, you're like, all right, well, we get it. They'll fight to a draw, or Kirk will get the upper hand, or Tracy will, beat him down. And then there's, Kirk has to, relent. And I mean, so that was kind of a lack of imagination, that they couldn't take this conflict. They couldn't elevate it and find another gear for it, except, hey, let's beat each other up. And like I say, like, usually in these episodes you get like one good fisticuff, confrontation. But here, by about the third or fourth, by the time they're duking it out in front of the hill people, as we put them, now you're just kind of like, all right, but we've already seen this. Like they've been doing this the whole episode. Like, so that, I'm not one to criticize good fight choreography.
It's a little tired.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, Gene, like let's figure out another way, another story element that could keep the conflict at a boil point, but not necessarily just, all right, now we'll tie their wrists together and they can try to stab each other.
I mean, it would have been interesting to know what was going on in Gene's head. Like, did he have a plan that Khan needed to be the most villainous villain? Is this the I'm gonna draw a corollary to X-Men because I've been watching X-Men '97 a lot lately. But is this the Juggernaut captain that we're going up against, and Khan is more of the Mister Sinister? Because I would argue that this could have been a really good Mister Sinister style episode where, you know, you get sort of that we know he's bad, but he's not obviously bad yet throughout their early meetings, and maybe they have some fisticuffs, but then later on you find out that he's manipulating this whole situation for his own, petard, and then is ending up getting hoisted by it at the end, which would have been a fantastic payoff. It's not overly complicated. I mean, I wouldn't say it was super cliche at the time necessarily, but it would have been compelling television nonetheless to be like, oh, his whole plan is foiled because there is no fountain of youth, and turns out nobody really had to die. He just screwed up this whole situation, and now he's embarrassed, and his master sinister plan has failed. And it's like, hey, that's good enough. Like, end this in the second act. And then you get this third act where it's like, well, we gotta fill out 8 more minutes, and the war's not going so good, boys. So and I imagine they had a big cigar. He's like, let's throw it at American flag. Talk about freedom.
Shatner can read the Constitution, and he's Canadian, so it's like a twist.
It fits, right? And it's odd because we're in this federation which has separated itself from obviously the divisions of prior Earth. Why is the United States so revered? I mean, obviously there's obvious explanation for that, but they talk about like World War III and World War IV and stuff. Like, okay, we know things went south. Like, why is this a thing? Like, I mean, you could say the same about any historical, timepiece in a bottle episode that they do, but it's just odd. I mean, the whole thing, the whole payoff in Act 3 was just like, what is happening right now? I did have to walk away for a second. I'm like, I what? So, Lord Uther, I'm dying to know what your thoughts are.
Well, I think you can get the message across without beating me over the head with the literal flagpole, because that's what the third act was completely about, right? And again, to Fert Derby's point about Bill Shatner reading the Constitution, because I feel like it was almost a chance for him to plead to Americans that we are great. I just feel like it was this whole thing that he was kind of doing, and then the flag is there. You want to end this right. If I was to pull this forward, if I was to take this episode in our timeline and pull it up here to have us actually create it, I would have them beam onto each other's ships and have it out at the end to where Kirk has to disable the Enterprise to save them. Because if we're talking, because I like the idea of them combating each other with first with their fists and their wits on the planet. Let's take it one more step. Let's get them onto their respective other ships, and let's see what happens there. But back then, I'm sure that might have been a tough, and that probably wasn't even the purpose of the episode. I just like a good space battle. I think that's how it is too. But yeah, again, if we want to take it one more step and kind of see who's can get the better of the other, let's put them on each other's ships where they can't blow each other up. So that was my thought there. And then Sulu's there, and then he's in command of the Enterprise, and he's not there. Like, if this guy was always stepping in for command, you think they would make sure he was around a little bit more, like schedule him when he's on the day shift or something. It's this poor guy. I just don't get it. But to me, the coup de grace is Spock's eyes and looking into them and being able to be manipulated like it's a force power.
Oh, yes.
So we've got Spock throwing his mental powers across the room to get that gal involved. And
have we ever seen that?
This is canon,
have we ever?
Well, yeah,
okay.
We have through the wall, right? But I thought,
yeah. Okay. That's
another
right.
time he touched through the stone, and then another time he was touching stone, and here he's not touching anything, allegedly. So, I mean, is this what Vulcans can do? Are they also empaths? That's what they're kind of alluding to here. So that's where I felt like they were starting to take the cheese and ladle it on. And then at the end, they just decided to take the entire gallon of it and just dump it on this episode with the reading of the Constitution and, the American flag always stands. And I love America. I mean, don't get me wrong. But, come on. Like, just give me some sci-fi here. I get the message. Just stop. So that's all I have to say about that.
You know what was frustrating was that they set up this disease and, oh, you guys can't ever leave and don't beam back to your ship and you're trapped here and you're just going to have to get used to it. And then we had this sort of, 3 or 4 minute sequence of McCoy sequencing things and analyzing things and so forth. And basically what it comes down to, and it was communicated in a rather convoluted batch of exposition, like, you actually, if you're really trying to pay attention, you may even have to kind of rewind to like hear how it is. But basically, McCoy looks at Jim and says, "Hey, there's no disease. None of this works. Everyone was fine." Like, and that's again, the ends justifies the means in that's a cool twist. Like, there is no disease, Jim. But then why did we spend the time with the creepy opening and the salt and I mean, I kind of felt cheated even starting. That's kind of when my first spider sense was tingling. Like, we had this whole great setup and then we just junked it like, midway through. And again, I like it as a twist that, oh, we could have left anytime we wanted. But I just thought that they handled it a little clumsily as far as like trying to get that point across. And I mean, like I say, they could have really streamlined and just say, Jim, I've been going over this. There's no, antibodies. There's nothing there. Like what we've been fooled. We've been bamboozled. And so I thought that, they kind of tripped over the sidewalk on that reveal. And then we just kind of go. So kudos to working in the national anthem or patriotic sounding music there as part of the soundtrack again. And to Lord Uther's point, I don't mind if you give Spock powers. I just don't want to feel like you did it, primarily for this episode to get out of this jam. And you're right, he is able to phase through rock, and now that you've jogged my memory, I appreciate that. But it's not something. We know the mind melt, right? We know the nerve pinch. We know kind of where we know he can slow down his bodily functions to appear dead. Like, we've kind of got a sense of Spock, and because there's a consistency to it, and you just hate it when it's kind of like, oh, here's something that we're going to use to, and the matter of convenience, the Dux ex machina of it all. I know UrzaMaster has studied those in great detail. But, don't make it that convenient. Make him work for it. He reaches through the bars and gives one of them a nerve pinch. He's got an extra long reach there when they're trapped in their cages. So that, I'm like, okay. But the
Which
whole,
is to the point
yeah.
we had kind of talked about before, that Spock and Data are like the Swiss Army knife and can get out of anytime you need an escape from a situation that you can't figure out, you can just have one of them come up with something. Right, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing, and then we question it because we don't see it in the movies. Did he? Right. You know what? Did he nerve pinch anyone in the movies?
In Star Trek 4.
That's right.
On the bus,
right.
And in the motion picture when he wants to go talk to V'ger, he gets one of the.
Then he does it to McCoy, or to Scotty. That's right.
Right. So.
No, to McCoy.
To McCoy.
No, he does it to Scotty.
Remember, no, McCoy. No. McCoy. Yeah.
And that's also in Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, not motion picture. But the interesting thing about this episode, and I just thought of this now, is that I think this might have been one of those episodes, and I'd love to know. I don't know if this research exists out there, so if any of our followers want to drop us some comments, if you know the background, I'm wondering if there were like extensive last-minute rewrites on this by Roddenberry, because it felt like in the first act, especially in those first opening scenes on the other ship, that this was going to be some kind of a Sodom and Gomorrah type tale. And really, you could have developed it into that. This whole time, with the perceived disease, turns out it's not a disease. they turned their back on this planet, and that's why they turned to salt. It could have been something along those lines where, well, if they'd just stayed on the planet long enough to adapt, then they don't get turned to salt. And it's like, okay, that would have been premise enough for an episode.
Yes.
And yet they decided, wow, that's not enough action. We don't have enough conflict. We need to make this an allegory. We got to make this some sort of a commentary. All well and good. I love layers, but it felt a little haphazard now looking back and kind of thinking about that. And I think that's probably a great place to jump in on our Warp Core ratings, because this one, and I'm going to leap here and say that this one feels like it's not quite as high on that Warp Core list as normal. Fert Derby, how did you feel about this episode?
I almost want to just, cut it, 2/3 of the way through and leave that third. I think that the episode starts off, in a very solid 5, even, maybe even a 5.5. It could have reached those. And I think that the last act really, I mean, if I want to be vindictive and Old Testament stuff, I'd probably give the last act no higher than a 3, 2.5, just because of how it plays against, what I thought could have developed into a really strong episode. So we'll just round it all up, and I'll say that this is probably a 3.5. I see a great Star Trek in there, and it's not Cat's Paw, and it's not Who Mourns for Adonis, and it doesn't leave me angry. It just leaves me very disappointed that they weren't able to bring a unifying, coherent wrap up, or take some of the ideas that they played with and then tease those out, because those might have made for more interesting story paths and conclusions overall. So it's a little low, I know, but I'm going to go 3.5 warp cores here, and stick the landing, Gene. Stick the landing. So
I'll go a little bit higher. I'll go 4.5 because I like the first 2/3 of it. So I'm trying to get as close to 2/3 on my rating as I can. So
okay.
I don't even know if 4.5 is 2/3 of 7, and I don't care because that's why I don't teach math. It had the elements of a good episode. If they would have went with my idea to put them on their ships at the end, it would have got 10 out of 7 because it was my idea. But for now, I'll go 4.5. Just a couple of those things that we mentioned kind of threw the episode off for me.
This might be a first here on the Warp Core podcast, but I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 7. I'm going to give it the lowest rating of all three of us. To be honest, I think I prefer Who Mourns for Adonis to this episode. And I have to say, it's partially the disappointment of how it completely falls apart in the last act. But it's also the fact that it's pretty convoluted even before that. And I think it could have been forgiven if they had somehow tied everything together better in the last act. But the fact that you get this disease that isn't a disease, this captain who's gone rogue on the Prime Directive, and then you get these two warring forces that is sort of based on race that feels very odd. It's like a Vietnam corollary that doesn't quite work. Even through all of that, I could have forgiven the episode if it would have tied together, and it didn't. So I have to look at this holistically and say this is one big disappointment of an episode. And it's none of the characters are specifically forward. So it doesn't feel like a Kirk episode, doesn't feel like a Spock episode or McCoy episode, but it also doesn't feel like a trio episode where all three are kind of working in harmony at some point. The most you get is Spock sort of tossing some weird verbal jabs at Kirk while he's getting his butt kicked in the cell next to him.
That's a good point.
And it was kind of funny, but at the same time, I'm what is happening right now? I had to get up and make a sandwich because I was all right, I think this one's going to be kind of a yawner. But I will say it's still Trek. It's still worth watching. It was kind of like they just had some costumes they needed to use up and threw some stories together at the last second and said, film it, cut, print, roll. With that, as always, and hopefully for a better future where we can explore strange new worlds that aren't as strange, hopefully, I say to you all, live long and prosper.